You're fired, Stevens. Clear out your desk and don't expect a reference. Incompetent assistants don't deserve second chances. Richard Blackstone delivered the words with surgical precision, watching his assistant of 3 years crumble before his mahogany desk. Margaret Stevens, a single mother of 2 who had worked 16-hour days without complaint, clutched her termination letter with trembling hands. "Mr. Blackstone, please." The Henderson contract was delayed by their legal team, not, "I don't pay you to make excuses. Security will escort you out." Richard's steel-gray eyes held no trace of humanity as he dismissed the woman with a wave of his manicured hand. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before disappointing your employer." Margaret's composure finally shattered. "I have children, Mr. Blackstone. It's 3 weeks before Christmas." "Not my problem." Richard was already reaching for his phone. "Johnson, send security to my office now." 20 minutes later, Richard Blackstone stepped out of his Bentley in front of the Moonlight Theater, his Italian leather shoes clicking against wet pavement. The building looked even more pathetic than the photos suggested. Faded marquee, chipped paint, the desperate air of something dying slowly. Perfect. This demolition would net him $40 million in profit once he built his luxury condos. But as he pushed through the theater's heavy doors, expecting to find the usual decay of failure, something extraordinary stopped him cold. Pure, crystalline music filled the air like liquid moonlight. So hauntingly beautiful, it seemed to reach directly into his chest and squeeze his heart. The sound was ethereal, otherworldly, as if heaven itself were singing through earthly instruments. And there, floating across the stage like a vision from a dream, was the most breathtaking woman he had ever seen. Jasmine Rivers moved with such divine grace that she seemed to defy every law of physics and probability. Her eyes were closed in perfect serenity, her face radiant with an expression of pure joy that Richard had never witnessed on any human being. She wore simple rehearsal clothes, a faded burgundy leotard and carefully mended tights, but she moved like royalty, like an angel who had decided to bless the earth with her presence. Each leap was a moment of flight, each turn a prayer made visible. The music swelled around her like she was conducting it with her very soul, and Richard found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might shatter this impossible moment of perfection. For 35 years, Richard Blackstone had lived in a world of spreadsheets and profit margins, where everything beautiful had a price tag and everyone had an agenda. But watching Jasmine dance, he felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Wonder, pure, childlike wonder. The music ended, and Jasmine opened her eyes, the most stunning brown eyes he'd ever seen, warm and alive with an inner light that made his usual world of corporate warfare seem gray and lifeless by comparison. She noticed him immediately, and instead of the usual recognition or flutter of interest his presence typically commanded, her expression shifted to something between mild confusion and polite indifference. "Harold," she called to an elderly man adjusting stage lights, "we have a visitor." Harold Martinez, the theater director, hurried forward with nervous energy. "Mr. Blackstone, thank you for coming, though perhaps—" "You must be the demolition man," Jasmine interrupted, gracefully stepping down from the stage. Her voice held the same musical quality as her movement, but with an edge that suggested she'd already taken his measure and found him wanting. Richard blinked. Had she just dismissed him as unimportant? "Richard Blackstone," he said, extending his hand with the confident smile that had intimidated boardrooms and charmed society wives. "And you're even more captivating up close." Jasmine looked at his outstretched hand like it might bite her, then met his eyes with an expression of polite disinterest. "Jasmine Rivers. And you're exactly as charming as I expected from someone who destroys beautiful things for profit." The casual brutality of her dismissal hit Richard like a physical blow. Women didn't reject him. They schemed for his attention, fought for his approval, melted under his practiced charm. They certainly didn't look at him like he was something unpleasant they'd discovered on their shoe. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. "I'm here to discuss the purchase of this property. Surely you understand the building's potential value exceeds its current usage." Its current usage of bringing beauty into the world? Jasmine tilted her head, studying him with those impossibly expressive eyes. Of teaching children from broken homes that they can create something magnificent. Of proving that not everything worthwhile can be measured in dollars and cents. That's very idealistic, but hardly practical. Tell me something, Mr. Blackstone. Jasmine's voice was soft, but her words cut deeper than any boardroom attack he'd ever faced. When was the last time you did something just because it was beautiful? Not profitable, not strategic, just beautiful? The question hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Richard Blackstone, who had an answer for everything, found himself completely speechless. Jasmine waited, her head tilted slightly, giving him every opportunity to respond. When the silence stretched too long, she smiled, a sad, knowing expression that somehow made her even more luminous. "That's what I thought," she said gently. "Enjoy your condos, Mr. Blackstone. I'm sure they'll be very profitable." She turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing in the theater lobby feeling like he'd just been dissected by an angel with a scalpel made of starlight. "She's quite something," Harold ventured nervously. "Jasmine's our principal dancer. Trained at Juilliard on full scholarship. Turned down contracts with major companies to stay here and teach our community programs." Richard watched Jasmine disappear through the stage doors, her words echoing in his mind like a haunting melody. When was the last time he'd done something just because it was beautiful? He couldn't remember. And that realization shook him more than any corporate defeat ever had. As he left the Moonlight Theater, Richard Blackstone carried with him the image of an angel who danced like she held the secrets of heaven, and the uncomfortable knowledge that he'd just met the one person who might be able to save his soul. If only he could figure out how to get her to stop looking at him like he was the devil himself. "Sir, there's a Mr. Blackstone here with 24 white roses, a string quartet, and what appears to be a diamond necklace." Jasmine Rivers looked up from lacing her point shoes, her eyebrows climbing toward her hairline. Through the theater's grimy window, she could see Richard Blackstone stepping out of his Bentley like some delusional prince, gesturing grandly at a team of florists who were apparently tasked with turning the Moonlight Theater's cracked sidewalk into Versailles. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, watching 4 tuxedo-clad musicians emerge from a second vehicle with their instruments. "Harold, did you hire a circus?" Harold Martinez peered through the curtains, his weathered face creasing with worry. "Oh dear. I think Mr. Blackstone is trying to court you?" "Court me?" Jasmine snorted, a sound that somehow managed to be both elegant and dismissive. "What is this, the 18th century? Next thing you know, he'll be asking my father for my hand and offering him 3 goats." But even as she mocked the absurdity of it all, Jasmine found herself oddly curious about what the imperious Richard Blackstone thought would impress her. In her 28 years, she'd dealt with her share of wealthy admirers, theater patrons who thought their donations entitled them to more than tax deductions, trust fund boys who saw ballet dancers as exotic trophies to collect. But none had ever shown up with what appeared to be a small orchestra. The stage door burst open and Richard strode in like he owned the place, which technically he was trying to do. He'd traded yesterday's corporate armor for a charcoal cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's rent, paired with jeans that had clearly never seen actual work. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and he carried himself with the confident swagger of a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. Too bad for him, Jasmine Rivers had never been particularly accommodating. "Miss Rivers," he said, his voice carrying that practiced charm that probably melted socialites at charity galas. "I believe we got off on the wrong foot yesterday." "Did we?" Jasmine continued stretching, deliberately not looking at him. "I thought we got off exactly right. You revealed yourself as a soulless property developer, and I treated you accordingly." Richard's confident smile flickered slightly, but he pressed on with the determination of a man who'd conquered Wall Street before his 30th birthday. "I'd like to make amends. Perhaps you'd join me for dinner tonight? I've reserved the private dining room at Le Bernardin." Jasmine finally looked up, her brown eyes sparkling with what Richard mistook for interest, but was actually barely contained laughter. "Le Bernardin? How wonderfully Predictable. It's the finest restaurant in the city, Richard said, a defensive note creeping into his voice. For impressing people who are impressed by overpriced fish and waiters who speak in whispers, Jasmine agreed cheerfully. Tell me, Mr. Blackstone, do you have any original thoughts or do you just follow some billionaire playbook? Step 1. Buy expensive things. Step 2. Assume everyone else wants expensive things. Step 3. Act confused when it doesn't work. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Richard felt his carefully constructed confidence cracking like ice under pressure. In his world, money solved everything. A platinum card was a universal translator, and luxury was the language everyone spoke. Apparently, Jasmine Rivers was fluent in a completely different dialect. "What would you prefer?" he asked, genuinely curious despite his wounded pride. "A food truck? McDonald's? How about getting to know someone before trying to buy them?" Jasmine stood, her movement fluid and graceful even in casual clothes. "But that would require treating me like a person instead of an acquisition target." Richard felt heat rise in his cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to recognize as embarrassment. "I was attempting to be courteous." "You were attempting to be impressive," Jasmine corrected, walking past him toward the stage. "There's a difference. Courtesy would have been asking what I like instead of assuming I'd be dazzled by your expense account." "And what do you like?" The question slipped out before Richard could stop it, and he was mortified to hear genuine interest in his own voice. Jasmine paused, looking back at him with those impossibly expressive eyes. For a moment, her expression softened slightly, as if she were seeing something in him besides the arrogant billionaire who wanted to demolish her sanctuary. "I like watching the sunrise from the theater's roof while practicing my bar work," she said quietly. "I like teaching 8-year-old Maria from the projects how to do a proper plie. I like the way music sounds in an old theater, how the walls hold on to every note like they're storing up beauty for lean times." Richard found himself hanging on every word, trying to picture this woman who found magic in broken buildings and joy in teaching children. "I like books that make me cry and hot chocolate that costs 99 cents from the bodega down the street," Jasmine continued. "I like things that are real, Mr. Blackstone, things that have heart and history and meaning beyond their price tags." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of Richard's worldview crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. "The roses are beautiful," Jasmine added, her tone gentler. "But they'll be dead in a week. The theater has been here for 60 years, and if I have anything to say about it, it'll be here for 60 more. She turned to leave, then paused again. "Oh, and Mr. Blackstone, your string quartet is blocking Mrs. Chen's parking spot. She's 83 and teaches our senior citizens movement class. She will absolutely key your Bentley if she can't park." As if summoned by her words, an elderly Asian woman appeared in the doorway, took one look at the orchestral chaos outside, and began speaking rapid Mandarin that needed no translation to convey her displeasure. Richard watched in fascination as Jasmine immediately switched to what sounded like fluent Mandarin, her face animated with warmth and respect as she spoke to the older woman. Mrs. Chen's expression softened, and she actually smiled. A real smile, not the careful expressions Richard was used to receiving from people who wanted his money. "She says your musicians play beautifully, but they're in her spot," Jasmine translated, though something in her eyes suggested that hadn't been the entirety of Mrs. Chen's commentary. "I'll have them moved immediately," Richard said, pulling out his phone. "Don't bother," Jasmine replied. "They're not needed. Save your grand gestures for someone who's impressed by them." She walked onto the stage, leaving Richard standing in the wings, feeling like he'd just been schooled by a master in a game whose rules he didn't even understand. As he watched her begin her warm-up routine, moving with that same ethereal grace that had stopped his world the day before, Richard Blackstone experienced something he'd never felt in his adult life, the desire to be worthy of someone who couldn't be bought. He just had no idea how to go about earning something that had never been for sale. Outside, Mrs. Chen was giving his string quartet a piece of her mind in 3 languages, and Richard found himself smiling despite his complete and utter defeat. Maybe it was time to learn some new rules. "Miss Rivers, I have a proposition that will save your theater and change your life forever." Richard Blackstone stood in the Moonlight Theater's rehearsal studio at 6 in the morning, looking impeccable despite the ungodly hour. He'd discovered that Jasmine arrived before dawn to practice, and if Mountain wouldn't come to Muhammad, well, Muhammad would learn to appreciate sunrise ballet. Jasmine didn't even pause in her bar routine, one perfectly extended leg creating a line so elegant it made Richard forget his carefully rehearsed speech. "Let me guess," she said, switching to her other leg with fluid grace. "You've decided to buy the theater and let us stay as your personal entertainment? How magnanimous." "Actually," Richard said, setting a thick legal document on the piano, "I'm offering you a contract, a very generous one." That got her attention. Jasmine lowered her leg and turned to face him, her expression skeptical but curious. She wore simple black leggings and an oversized sweater that had seen better days. Yet she somehow managed to look more regal than the society queens who spent fortunes trying to achieve half her natural elegance. "I'm listening," she said, though her tone suggested she was already unimpressed. Richard felt his pulse quicken. This was his element: negotiation, persuasion, the art of the deal. "I want to hire you as my personal cultural consultant. 6 months, exclusive contract. Your job would be to educate me in the finer things: art, music, whatever you think I'm missing." Jasmine blinked slowly, like she was processing something particularly absurd. "You want to pay me to give you culture lessons?" "The compensation is substantial," Richard pressed on, his confidence building. $500,000 for 6 months of your time. Plus, I'll delay the demolition of this building until the contract expires. Everyone wins." "Everyone wins," Jasmine repeated slowly, and Richard completely missed the dangerous edge in her voice. "Except for the part where you're essentially trying to buy me like a cultural escort service." The words hit Richard like a slap across the face. I didn't mean..." "What exactly did you mean, Mr. Blackstone?" Jasmine stepped closer, and Richard caught that intoxicating scent of rosin and determination that seemed to follow her everywhere. "Because it sounds like you're offering me $500,000 to pretend to enjoy your company for 6 months. I'm offering you a chance to save your theater while getting paid handsomely for doing what you already do, sharing your knowledge of the arts," Richard said, but even to his own ears it sounded hollow. "And what happens after 6 months?" Jasmine asked. "When your cultural education is complete and you've decided whether I've earned the right to keep my home?" Richard felt his carefully constructed argument crumbling. "We would negotiate further terms based on whether I've been a good enough teacher, whether I've sufficiently entertained you." Jasmine's voice was dangerously quiet. "Tell me, Mr. Blackstone, in this arrangement, am I your employee or your pet?" The accusation stung because there was just enough truth in it to hurt. Richard had thought he was being clever, finding a way to spend time with her while solving the theater's financial problems. Instead, he'd apparently offered to purchase her like expensive artwork. "You're twisting my words," he said weakly. "Am I?" Jasmine picked up the contract, flipping through pages of legal jargon with practiced efficiency. "Exclusive availability. Personal consultation services, discretion clause. This reads like a very expensive prenup for a relationship that doesn't exist." She set the papers down and looked at him with something that might have been disappointment, which somehow hurt worse than her anger. "You know what the saddest part is?" she said quietly. "For about 5 seconds yesterday when you asked what I liked, I thought you might actually be capable of seeing me as a person instead of a problem to be solved with your checkbook." Richard felt something crack inside his chest. "Jasmine, it's Miss Rivers," she corrected, her professional distance snapping back into place like armor. "And your generous offer is declined." "But the theater..." "Will survive without your blood money," Jasmine interrupted. "We always have." Richard watched her gather her things, desperation clawing at his throat. "What if I doubled the offer?" Jasmine paused at the door, looking back at him with an expression of such pity that Richard wanted to disappear into the floor. "Mr. Blackstone, you could offer me every dollar you have and it wouldn't matter, because you still don't understand the most basic truth about human connection." She tilted her head slightly, studying him like a fascinating but tragic specimen. "You can't buy your way into someone's heart. You have to earn it." "Then tell me how," Richard said, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Tell me what I need to do." For a moment, Jasmine's expression softened, and Richard saw a flicker of the woman who spoke gently to elderly Chinese ladies and taught ballet to children from the projects. "Start by figuring out who you are when you're not trying to acquire something," she said. "Because the man who fired his assistant 3 days before Christmas? The one who thinks throwing money at people is the same as caring about them? That man has nothing I want." She left him standing in the empty rehearsal studio, surrounded by mirrors that reflected his failure from every angle. Richard slumped into a chair, staring at the rejected contract that had seemed so brilliant 12 hours ago. In the harsh morning light streaming through the studio windows, he could see it for what it really was. The desperate scheme of a man who had forgotten how to connect with another human being without a financial transaction involved. His phone buzzed with messages from his office, his lawyers, his various business interests that required immediate attention. But for the first time in his adult life, Richard Blackstone ignored them all. Instead, he sat in the silence of the empty theater, trying to remember the last time he'd done something just because it was beautiful, and wondering if it was too late to learn how to be the kind of man who deserved an angel's attention. Outside, the city was waking up. Ordinary people heading to ordinary jobs, living ordinary lives filled with the kind of connections that couldn't be purchased or negotiated. Richard envied every single one of them. But as he sat there in the growing sunlight, watching dust motes dance like tiny ballerinas in the golden air, something shifted inside him. For the first time in years, Richard Blackstone wasn't thinking about profit margins or acquisition targets. He was thinking about what it might feel like to earn something that had never been for sale. And despite everything, despite his spectacular failure and Jasmine's devastating rejection, he found himself smiling. Maybe there was hope for him yet. "Excuse me, miss, but I think you dropped this." Jasmine looked up from her grocery shopping to find Richard Blackstone standing in the cereal aisle of her neighborhood bodega, holding a crumpled $20 bill and looking completely out of place among the off-brand cornflakes and expired milk. Gone was the $1,000 suit, replaced by jeans that actually looked lived in and a simple black sweater. His hair was slightly mussed and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd been doing some serious soul-searching. "I didn't drop anything," Jasmine said carefully, eyeing him with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust billionaires bearing gifts. "Are you sure?" Richard held up the 20 with an innocent expression that didn't fool her for a second. "Because I distinctly saw you." "Mr. Blackstone, what are you doing in my grocery store?" "Shopping," he said, hefting a basket that contained the most bizarre collection of items she'd ever seen. Organic kale, Lucky Charms, instant ramen, and what appeared to be cat food. "Same as you." "You don't have a cat," Jasmine observed. "How do you know?" "Because you're the kind of man who would hire someone to have a cat for you." Richard's mouth twitched with what might have been amusement. "Actually, the cat food is for Duchess. She lives in the alley behind the theater. Gray tabby, very opinionated about brands." Jasmine blinked. "You've been feeding the theater cat?" "Someone has to. She's been looking a bit thin." Richard shifted uncomfortably, as if discussing his kindness to stray animals was more embarrassing than his previous attempts at bribery. Harold mentioned she was a fixture around the place. This was unexpected. Jasmine studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or ulterior motives, but found only genuine awkwardness. "For how long?" 3 weeks, Richard admitted. "Ever since you told me to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to acquire something." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Jasmine felt her carefully maintained defenses wobble slightly. "And what have you discovered?" "That I'm apparently the kind of person who has conversations with stray cats at 2 in the morning. Richard said wryly. "Duchess is an excellent listener, by the way. Very judgmental, but excellent." Despite herself, Jasmine felt her lips twitch. "What else?" Richard set down his basket and leaned against the shelf of questionable pasta sauce, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "I discovered that I haven't been grocery shopping in 15 years. I forgot how democratic it is. Everyone needs milk and bread regardless of their net worth. Revolutionary concept, Jasmine said dryly, but her tone had lost its edge. I also learned that Mrs. Chen makes the best dumplings in the city, and that she's been worried about you overworking yourself. Richard's voice was casual, but his eyes were intent. She mentioned you've been skipping meals, staying late at the theater to prep for the fundraiser. Jasmine felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mrs. Chen worries too much. Does she? Richard stepped closer, and Jasmine caught a different scent than his usual expensive cologne. Something warmer, more human. Because you look like you haven't slept in days. I'm fine. When was the last time you ate something that wasn't coffee and determination? The question was asked with such gentle concern that Jasmine felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. In her world of constant financial stress and responsibility for others, people rarely worried about whether she was taking care of herself. I eat, she said defensively. Mrs. Chen's dumplings don't count if she forced them on you, because you looked like you were about to faint during class. She told you that? She tells me lots of things. Apparently, I'm a good listener when I'm not trying to demolish people's lives. Richard picked up a box of instant oatmeal from her basket, studying the generic brand with surprising focus. She also mentioned that you've been supporting your mother's medical bills since you were 22. Jasmine went very still. That's not your business. No, it's not. Richard agreed quietly. But it explains why you turned down my ridiculous contract. You've been carrying the weight of the world alone for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like when someone offers to help, without expecting something in return. Is that what you're doing? Jasmine's voice was barely above a whisper. Helping? Richard was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her heart skip. I'm trying to become the kind of man who deserves to stand in a grocery store and have a normal conversation with the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. The words hit Jasmine like a physical blow. There was no practiced charm in them, no calculated seduction, just raw honesty that left her feeling exposed and off balance. Richard, she started, then stopped, unsure what to say. I know I've made a mess of everything, he continued, his voice gaining strength. I know you have every reason to hate me, but I'm learning, Jasmine. I'm trying to understand what it means to care about something, someone, more than profit margins and acquisition targets. He reached for her hand, then stopped, his fingers hovering inches from hers. May I? The simple request for permission undid something inside Jasmine's chest. Slowly, she turned her palm up, and Richard's fingers intertwined with hers. His hands were softer than she'd expected, but warm and steady. I want to know you, he said simply. Not as a challenge to overcome or a problem to solve, but as you. The woman who speaks Mandarin with elderly ballet teachers and finds magic in broken buildings. The one who teaches children to fly and makes 99-cent hot chocolate taste like liquid gold. Jasmine felt tears prick her eyes. You can't just change overnight. I'm not trying to, Richard said, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. I'm trying to change day by day, choice by choice. Starting with learning that the best conversations happen in grocery stores at 9 p.m. and that some things, the most important things, can't be bought. Around them, the bodega hummed with quiet evening activity. Mrs. Martinez rang up late-night shoppers, teenagers argued over energy drink flavors, and the whole scene felt wonderfully, perfectly ordinary. Mrs. Chen was right about one thing, Jasmine said finally. What's that? I haven't been eating enough. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. I don't suppose you know how to cook anything besides whatever money can buy? Richard's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. I make excellent reservations. That's not cooking. Then I guess you'll have to teach me. His voice held a note of wonder, as if the idea of learning something from scratch was a revelation. Think you can handle a student who's been spoiled by personal chefs for the last decade? Jasmine found herself smiling back, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. I've taught 8-year-olds to grand jeter. How hard can one billionaire be? Probably harder than you think, Richard admitted, but I'm a very motivated student. As they walked to the checkout together, Jasmine felt something shift between them, a tentative bridge built from honest words and the simple intimacy of choosing groceries together. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was possibility. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the future site of Blackstone Luxury Residences, where culture goes to die and dreams are demolished for profit. The voice that cut through the Moonlight Theater's fundraising gala belonged to Victoria Sterling, Richard's ex-fiancée, and the kind of socialite who collected scandals like vintage Chanel. She stood on the theater's small stage in a gown that cost more than most people's cars, her perfectly veneered smile glittering under the stage lights as she held a microphone like a weapon. Jasmine felt the blood drain from her face as she stood frozen in the wings, still wearing her performance costume. The ethereal white tutu she'd worn for the evening's centerpiece, a solo piece that had moved the audience to tears just moments before. Around her, the gathered donors and theater supporters fell silent, their champagne glasses suspended mid-sip as Victoria's words sank in. "Oh yes," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with malicious glee. "You didn't know, did you? Your beloved knight in shining armor, Richard Blackstone, the man who's been playing house with your little prima ballerina, still owns the demolition contracts for this charming little hovel." Richard shot to his feet from his table near the stage, his face pale with horror. "Victoria, stop. This isn't what, darling? The truth?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Tell them, Richard. Tell these lovely people how you've been planning to tear down their precious theater from the very beginning. Tell them how you've been using poor little Jasmine here as your personal entertainment, while you finalize the paperwork to destroy her life." The theater erupted in whispers and gasps. Jasmine felt the world tilt around her as she caught fragments of conversation. Playing her for a fool. Typical rich bastard. How could she be so naive? But the worst sound was the silence that fell when Richard tried to speak. It's more complicated than... He looked directly at Jasmine, his eyes desperate and pleading. "Jasmine, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Jasmine's voice carried across the theater with crystal clarity, cutting through the whispers like a blade. She stepped onto the stage, her tutu catching the lights like spun moonlight, every inch the tragic heroine from a classical ballet. "Explain how you've been lying to me for weeks?" "I never lied to you," Richard said, moving toward the stage, but the crowd seemed to part around him like he carried a plague. "I never said I'd drop the demolition plans. I needed time to figure out how to... How to what?" Jasmine's voice rose, and Richard realized he'd never heard her truly angry before. It was magnificent and terrible, like watching a swan transform into a phoenix. "How to let me down gently after you'd had your fun. How to explain to your board that you'd been slumming with the help." "That's not fair, and you know it," Richard said, his own voice gaining strength. "What we have is real. You know it's real." Victoria clapped slowly, mockingly. "Oh, this is better than I hoped. She actually believed you cared about her." "I do care about her," Richard snapped, whirling to face his ex-fiancée. "More than I've ever cared about anything in my life." "Then why?" Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the theater. "Why are the demolition contracts still active? Why did Harold receive an eviction notice yesterday that you signed 2 weeks ago?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet as he realized what had happened. "That was before. I tried to cancel it, but the legal department said..." "Liar." The word dropped from Jasmine's lips like a stone into still water. "Harold showed me the signature date, Richard. You signed those papers the same day you brought me groceries. The same day you told me you were trying to become a better man." Richard felt something break inside his chest. "Jasmine, please. The legal paperwork takes time." "I've been trying to stop it, but corporate contracts aren't what? Aren't more important than the feelings of one stupid dancer who thought you might actually..." Her voice broke, and Richard saw tears glittering in her eyes like stars going out. "Who thought you might actually care about something besides money?" The crowd was riveted, watching the drama unfold like spectators at a gladiator match. But all Richard could see was the devastation on Jasmine's face, the way her shoulders curved inward as if she were trying to protect herself from a physical blow. "I was going to tell you," he said desperately. "I've been working with lawyers to break the contracts to find a way to save the theater without what? Without losing money?" Jasmine stepped closer to the edge of the stage, and Richard saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something far worse. Disappointment so profound it felt like grief. "You want to know what the saddest part is, Richard? For a few weeks I actually believed you were capable of change. I thought maybe, just maybe, there was a real person underneath all that money and arrogance." She looked out at the crowd of donors and supporters, her voice gaining strength even as tears tracked down her cheeks. "But Victoria's right. You can't change what you are. And what you are is a man who destroys beautiful things for profit, who lies to women who are foolish enough to trust him, and who thinks love is just another business transaction." "That's not true," Richard said, his voice breaking. "What we have isn't what we have," Jasmine interrupted, "is over." She began pulling off her jewelry, the simple pearl earrings he'd given her last week, claiming he'd found them in a vintage shop and thought they suited her. He'd lied about that too. They were from Cartier, and he'd been afraid she'd refuse them if she knew their true value. "Everything you gave me was a lie," she said, dropping the earrings onto the stage where they clattered like broken dreams. "The groceries, the conversations, the way you looked at me like I mattered, all of it was just part of your long game." "No," Richard said, stepping toward the stage. "Jasmine, you have to believe me. I love you." The words rang out across the theater, and for a moment everything stopped. Richard had never said those words to another human being, not to Victoria during their 2-year engagement, not to anyone. He'd thought love was a weakness, a liability that successful men couldn't afford. But looking at Jasmine in her white tutu, tears streaming down her face as she stared at him with broken trust, Richard finally understood what love actually was. It was the willingness to give up everything for someone else's happiness. It was the desire to be worthy of another person's faith. It was the knowledge that losing someone's respect was worse than losing everything else combined. "Love?" Jasmine laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't even know what that word means. Love isn't something you can acquire or negotiate for. Love is trust, Richard. Love is honesty. Love is putting someone else's happiness before your own profit margins." She looked out at the crowd one last time, her chin raised with regal dignity despite her tears. "The Moonlight Theater has survived 60 years of challenges. We'll survive Richard Blackstone too." As she turned to leave the stage, Richard felt panic claw at his throat. "Jasmine, wait. Please. I can fix this. I can make this right." She paused at the wing entrance, looking back at him one final time. "No, you can't. Because to fix this, you'd have to become someone you're not. And we both know that's impossible." She disappeared into the wings, leaving Richard standing alone in front of a crowd that looked at him with varying degrees of disgust, pity, and contempt. Victoria's triumphant smile was the brightest thing in the room. "Well," Victoria said into the microphone, "I think that concludes tonight's entertainment. Don't forget to thank your host Richard Blackstone for such an illuminating evening." The crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with gossip and judgment. Several people made pointed remarks as they passed Richard, but he barely heard them. All he could think about was the look in Jasmine's eyes. Not hatred, which he could have fought against, but profound disappointment, which felt like a death sentence. Harold Martinez approached tentatively, his lined face etched with sorrow. "Mr. Blackstone, I think it might be best if you—" "Harold," Richard interrupted, his voice hoarse. "The contracts. I swear to you I've been trying to—" "I know you have, son," Harold said gently, and the kindness in his voice almost undid Richard completely. "But trying isn't the same as doing, and trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired." As the theater emptied around him, Richard stood alone on the stage where Jasmine had danced like an angel just an hour before. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat and the distant echo of Victoria's satisfied laughter. He'd spent his entire adult life building an empire, accumulating power and wealth beyond most people's dreams. But in the space of a single evening, he'd lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered, the respect and love of a woman who had shown him what it meant to be human. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the city in pristine white that would be dirty and gray by morning. Richard thought it was fitting. Everything beautiful, it seemed, was destined to be ruined by the world's touch, especially by his. Richard Blackstone just donated $50 million to save the Moonlight Theater, and he's giving up all development rights to the property forever. The news anchor's voice echoed through the theater's empty lobby at 6 in the morning, 3 weeks after the fundraising gala disaster. Jasmine stood frozen by the old radio, her coffee mug suspended halfway to her lips, hardly believing what she was hearing. In an unprecedented move, the billionaire developer held a press conference yesterday announcing the creation of the Moonlight Foundation, which will ensure the theater's operations for the next century. Mr. Blackstone was not available for comment, but sources close to him say he's already left New York for an extended stay in Europe. Jasmine's hand trembled as she set down her mug. Europe. He was gone. Jasmine? Harold's voice came from behind her, gentle and cautious. Did you hear? I heard. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow and distant. $50 million. The lawyers called this morning. It's real. No strings, no conditions, no way for him to take it back. Harold moved to stand beside her, his weathered face creased with concern. The foundation documents were filed a week ago. He's been planning this since the gala, Jasmine finished quietly. Since the night she'd called him a liar and broken his heart in front of half of Manhattan's cultural elite. He also did something else, Harold said carefully, pulling a thick envelope from his jacket. This came for you yesterday. Courier service, very official. With shaking hands, Jasmine opened the envelope. Inside was a deed, the deed to a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, made out in her name. Attached was a letter written in Richard's precise handwriting. Jasmine, by the time you read this, the theater will be safe forever, and I'll be far enough away that you won't have to worry about running into me at the bodega. The house belonged to my grandmother, the only person who ever loved me without expecting something in return. She died when I was 12, and my father sold it immediately because he said sentiment was bad business. I bought it back 3 years ago but never had the courage to visit it. I think she would have liked you. You both believed in beautiful things. The deed is clean, no mortgages, no strings, no way for me to take it back even if I wanted to. Which I don't. You said love means putting someone else's happiness before your own profit margins. I'm a slow learner, but I'm not completely hopeless. I know I can never undo the hurt I caused, but maybe I can finally do something just because it's beautiful. Because you're beautiful, inside and out, and you deserve a home that's worthy of the joy you bring to the world. Dance for me sometimes, even if I'm not there to see it. All my love, and now I finally understand what that means. Richard P.S. Mrs. Chen has a key. She says the garden needs someone who understands beauty to bring it back to life. I told her I knew exactly the right person. Jasmine's vision blurred as tears spilled down her cheeks. Through the theater windows, she could see the first hints of dawn painting the sky in soft pastels. The same colors she'd described to Richard that morning in the bodega when she'd told him about watching sunrises from the theater roof. Jasmine. Harold's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? He remembered, she whispered, clutching the letter to her chest. Everything I told him about what I loved, he remembered it all. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Child, get yourself to Brooklyn Heights. The garden is waiting, and so am I. And bring tissues, you'll need them. An hour later, Jasmine stood in front of a stunning brownstone that looked like something from a fairy tale. Mrs. Chen was waiting on the front steps, holding a set of old-fashioned brass keys and wearing an expression that was part satisfaction, part sorrow. He came to me 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Chen said without preamble, pressing the keys into Jasmine's trembling hands. Asked me to look after the place until you were ready. Said he wanted to do something right for once in his miserable life. Mrs. Chen, I can't accept this, it's too much. Child, Mrs. Chen interrupted firmly. That boy spent 3 weeks learning Mandarin just so he could ask my permission to give you something that mattered to him. He practiced his pronunciation for hours, stumbling over words like a schoolboy just so he could tell me about his grandmother in my own language. Jasmine felt her knees go weak. He learned Mandarin? Badly, Mrs. Chen said with a small smile. But with great sincerity. He said his grandmother spoke it. She was a missionary's daughter who grew up in China. He wanted to honor her memory by doing this properly. As they walked through the house, Jasmine felt like she was stepping into a dream. Every room was filled with warmth and character, with built-in bookshelves and window seats and the kind of architectural details that spoke of love and care. But it was the back garden that undid her completely. It was overgrown and wild, but she could see the bones of something magnificent. Rose bushes waiting to bloom, fruit trees heavy with promise, and in the center, a small gazebo that looked like it had been designed for dancing under the stars. He said you told him you liked to practice your barre work at sunrise, Mrs. Chen said quietly. Said he wanted you to have a place where you could dance with the whole sky as your audience. Jasmine sank onto the gazebo steps, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Richard had done. This wasn't just a house, it was a home built from every conversation they'd shared, every preference she'd mentioned, every dream she'd whispered. It was proof that he'd been listening, really listening, even when she'd thought he was just another rich man trying to buy his way into her life. Why didn't he wait? She asked, her voice breaking. Why didn't he tell me about any of this? Mrs. Chen sat beside her, patting her hand with the gentle authority of someone who'd seen enough heartbreak to recognize it in all its forms. Because he knew you'd refuse if he was here to ask. And because he finally learned the difference between buying something and earning it. But I was so cruel to him that night. I said terrible things. You said true things, Mrs. Chen corrected. And sometimes the truth is the only thing that can save someone. That boy needed to lose everything to understand what really mattered. Jasmine's phone rang, interrupting her tears. It was Harold, his voice breathless with excitement. Jasmine, you need to come back to the theater right now. There's something else, something he didn't tell anyone about. 20 minutes later, Jasmine stood in the theater lobby, staring at a bronze plaque that hadn't been there when she'd left that morning. The Jasmine Rivers Moonlight Theater where dreams take flight. Some things are worth more than money. The paperwork was filed this morning, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. He renamed the entire theater after you, made it official with the city, the Arts Council, everyone. Your name will be on this building forever. Jasmine felt the world tilt around her. Richard hadn't just saved the theater, he'd made it hers. He'd given her immortality in bronze and stone, ensuring that long after they were both gone, her name would be associated with beauty and art and the magic of dance. But even as her heart swelled with gratitude and something dangerously close to forgiveness, the reality of his absence hit her like a physical blow. He was gone. He'd given her everything she'd ever dreamed of and then disappeared, like some tragic hero from a Russian novel. Mrs. Chen, she said suddenly, turning to the older woman who'd been watching her with knowing eyes. When he came to you about the house, did he say anything else? Anything about where he was going? Mrs. Chen smiled mysteriously. He said he was going to learn how to be worthy of an angel's forgiveness. Said it might take him a lifetime, but he had nothing but time now that he'd finally done something beautiful. That evening, Jasmine danced alone on the Moonlight Theater stage. Not a performance, but a prayer made manifest in movement. She danced for Richard wherever he was, pouring her heart into every leap and turn. She danced gratitude for his sacrifice, forgiveness for his failures, and love for the man he'd become in the end. And as the theater's old walls held her movements like a blessing, Jasmine Rivers finally understood what Richard had tried to tell her with deeds instead of words. Sometimes love means letting go, and sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to become who they were always meant to be. The last notes of music faded into silence, and Jasmine stood alone in the spotlight, tears streaming down her face. She whispered 2 words to the empty theater, knowing somehow that wherever Richard Blackstone was in the world, he would feel them in his heart. Thank you. Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time it stayed white and pure, covering the city in beauty that would last until spring brought new beginnings. And in a small cafe in Prague, Richard Blackstone felt his phone buzz with a news alert about a ballet dancer who'd just been named artistic director of a newly endowed theater in New York. He smiled through his own tears, ordered another coffee, and opened the worn notebook where he'd been learning to write poetry. He had promises to keep, and a lifetime to figure out how to keep them. Some love stories end with a kiss. Others end with transformation. The best ones end with hope.